The morning of April 8th, 1994, was gray and cold in Seattle, the kind of morning that felt like the sky had already given up before it began. Gary Smith arrived at the address on Lake Washington Boulevard just before 9, tool bag in hand, contracted by Vecca Electric to install a security system at the property. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. It was a routine job at a large house, the kind of work he had done dozens of times in the wealthier neighborhoods of the city. He parked, walked toward the detached greenhouse above the garage, and noticed through the glass panels that someone was lying on the floor inside. He assumed the person was sleeping. He kept working. It was only when he looked more carefully, pausing to study the stillness of the figure, that something shifted in him, a slow and terrible recognition that what he was seeing was not sleep. Gary Smith called 911 at 8:42 in the morning, and with that call, an era ended. What happened in the 72 hours before Gary Smith walked across that gravel path is a story told in fragments, in rumors, and in tearful interviews, but never quite completely. The truth of those 3 days is stranger than most people realize. Kurt Cobain had been lying dead inside that greenhouse since April 5th, 1994. While his management, his record label, and his wife had grown increasingly anxious about his disappearance without anyone searching the one place where he had been the entire time. If this kind of documentary storytelling speaks to you, if you believe the real history behind the headlines deserves to be told with honesty and care, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Every subscriber makes it possible to keep bringing these stories to light. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Not April 8th, April 1st. Kurt Cobain had checked himself out of the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles on April 1st, 1994, climbing over the facility wall after less than 48 hours of what was supposed to be a serious intervention. He had been admitted at the insistence of friends, bandmates, and Courtney Love, who had organized a formal intervention at their home in late March. People who were present described the gathering as emotionally charged, full of tears and desperate attempts to reach a man who had already, in some private part of himself, made a decision. Kurt sat through most of it in near silence, absorbing everything with a stillness that made several people in that room more frightened, not less. He flew to Los Angeles, checked into Exodus, and then climbed a wall, hailed a cab to the airport, and vanished from the people who were trying to save him. No one knew where he was for several days. Courtney Love hired private investigator Tom Grant on April 3rd, explaining that Kurt had gone missing and that she feared for his life. Grant flew to Seattle, visited the Lake Washington house with Kurt's friend Dylan Carlson, and searched significant portions of the property. He did not open the greenhouse above the garage. This single overlooked space would become the center of decades of speculation about what really transpired in those final days. Why was that structure never entered? Why did a trained investigator, hired specifically to find a man feared to be suicidal, fail to open every door on a property he visited more than once? These questions have never received a satisfying answer, and they hang over the official account of events like weather that will not clear. What is documented is that Kurt Cobain purchased a shotgun 5 days before his death. He and Dylan Carlson went to Stan Baker Sports in Seattle on March 30th. Carlson later said he had no indication of Kurt's intentions, believing the weapon was for protection. The gun, a Remington Model 1120 gauge shotgun, was recovered at the scene on April 8th. No waiting period was required by Washington state law. The transaction took minutes. By the end of that afternoon, Kurt Cobain had in his possession the instrument of his own death, and the people who loved him were making plans to help him recover, completely unaware of what he had already decided. The days between April 1st and April 5th are only partially reconstructed. What investigators pieced together suggested that Kurt returned to the Lake Washington property sometime in the first days of April, let himself into the greenhouse with a key, and spent his final hours in that glass-enclosed space in the particular silence that Seattle's overcast skies produce. Cigarette butts and a can of root beer were found near the body, details so mundane against the magnitude of what happened that they remain almost unbearable to read about. He had written a note in red ink, addressed not to his wife or his daughter, but to Bada, the name he had used since early childhood for an imaginary companion. He wrote about exhaustion, about the roar of crowds that had become noise without meaning, about a love of music that had been burned away somewhere inside the machinery of fame. Near the end, he used a line drawn from Neil Young about it being better to burn out than to fade away, but he reversed the words from their original sequence in a way that has never been definitively explained. Whether the reversal was deliberate, whether it carried a specific intended meaning, or whether it was simply a mind in profound distress misremembering a lyric, remains an open question that no amount of analysis has resolved. The note has been studied by handwriting specialists, psychologists, and investigators for 30 years. No consensus exists, and that irreducible ambiguity inside an already ambiguous document is in some ways the most honest summary of everything that surrounded his final days. Here is the detail that most accounts pass over because it is uncomfortable to sit with. 3 full days elapsed between April 5th and April 8th. During those 72 hours, the people closest to Kurt Cobain were actively and urgently searching for him. Tom Grant was driving around Seattle. Kurt's mother, Wendy, had filed a missing persons report with the police. The Lake Washington property had been visited more than once. Phone calls were being made and leads were being followed. And during all of that, Kurt's body was less than 100 feet from the main house, behind a door that no one opened. For those who accept the official account, this is a catastrophic failure of coordination among people acting under extreme stress. For those who have spent years questioning that account, it is the unresolvable center of their suspicion. Both positions have been held by reasonable people for 3 decades. When Gary Smith's 911 call brought Seattle police to the property, officers noted immediately that the scene bore all the characteristics of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The suicide note was recovered nearby. There was no sign of struggle. The medical examiner placed the time of death at April 5th, meaning the body had been there for approximately 72 hours before discovery. The toxicology report released in the weeks following showed a blood morphine level 3 times the threshold typically considered lethal. Kurt had used heroin shortly before he died. Whether this was part of a deliberate plan or a final act of self-numbing, the physical record cannot answer. The official conclusion was suicide. Seattle police have reviewed that finding on multiple subsequent occasions in response to sustained public pressure, and it has not changed. The first media bulletins began moving across wire services in the early afternoon of April 8th. Radio stations across the United States started receiving reports before noon Pacific time, and many of the earliest were incomplete, some describing the cause as a possible overdose before the scene details had been officially confirmed. The correction came quickly, but it did not matter because by then the news was spreading in every direction at once. Stations interrupted programming. Disc jockeys who had been teenagers when Nevermind turned the music world upside down found themselves speaking into microphones without adequate language, because there is no phrase that has ever been invented to tell your listeners that the person whose voice shaped a decade of their lives has died at 27 in a room shared only with silence. MTV went to continuous coverage within hours. The phones at radio stations did not stop ringing. Fans arrived outside the Lake Washington address before police had finished working the scene, standing in the Seattle drizzle the way people stand when grief has nowhere else to go. Several left flowers against the fence. Several simply stood without moving, as if waiting for something that would change what had already happened. Nothing did. Courtney Love organized a public memorial reading of excerpts from the suicide note on April 10th at Flag Pavilion in Seattle, and hundreds of fans stood in the rain to hear it. Frances Bean Cobain was 20 months old. She was not there. What the following 24 hours produced, beyond the institutional responses of police and media and labels issuing statements, was something harder to describe, because in 1994, information did not arrive everywhere simultaneously. People learned about Kurt's death in private, specific moments. Someone heard it on a car radio while a cassette of Nevermind sat on the passenger seat. Someone was told by a teacher who had heard it driving to work. Someone was standing in a record store when the announcement came through speakers that had been playing Nirvana an hour before. Each moment of learning was individual and unshared in a way that collective grief rarely is anymore. And each person had to decide, alone, what to do with what they had just been given. The generation that was between 15 and 30 in April 1994 has carried something from those days that has never been fully named or set down. There is something particular about losing a public figure to suicide at that age, when you are still building the interior structure that will help you hold loss later in life. Kurt was 27. He had made 3 records. He had a daughter who was not yet old enough to remember his voice except from tape. He had written music that told enormous numbers of people they were not alone in their pain, and then he had died from his own. And that dissonance has lived inside an entire generation for 30 years. Francis Bean Cobain grew up with a father built from recordings and photographs and other people's memories, which is a particular kind of orphanhood that has no precise name. She has spoken about him with a clarity that is remarkable given everything she was asked to carry. She read his journals and listened to every tape, and she said something that is perhaps the most honest observation anyone has ever made about who Kurt Cobain actually was, as opposed to what he became. She said the story people told about her father was often the story they needed for themselves, not the story that was true, that he was not a martyr or a symbol or a cautionary figure, that he was a sick man living in serious pain who did not receive the help he needed at the time he needed it most. The greenhouse above the garage on Lake Washington Boulevard was eventually demolished by later owners of the property. The house still stands. People still come sometimes, standing on the sidewalk by the water, looking at a building where nothing of what they are looking for remains. What they are searching for is not the structure, it is the moment itself. That specific gray April morning when a man with a tool bag stopped to look through a window and changed everything. And the question that 30 years have not answered, not the procedural questions or the toxicology questions or the questions about who knew what and when, but the deeper one, is whether we have learned anything at all about what we owe each other when someone is calling for help in a language we have not yet learned to hear.